Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 4 game from the Charlotte Summer GM-IM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 3 video, you know that I took a relatively short draw with white against Grandmaster Tengi Ringor, in part because I was not too familiar with the opening that arose, but a much bigger reason was because I'd played an 138 move game in round 2, and it actually had like a half an hour break in between round 2 and rounds 3 and was just simply exhausted. Now, this one actually turned out to be my 3rd longest game of the year, so fair warning, this is another really, really long game. And yeah, I don't know what it is about my games. They're super long. Well, I kind of do know what it is. It's kind of reflective of my style, but maybe we'll talk about that at some point. So yeah, and anyways, in this one, my opponent was none other than Alexander Ostrovskiy. I am Alexander Ostrovskiy, and that name should be familiar to some of you if you've been following this channel because I've played him already a few times this year. He's very active on the tournament circuit, and he's another player trying to become a Grandmaster, playing in norm tournaments, and is also from New York, so we came up together in some respects, even though I believe he's a few years younger than me. In any case, he was white in this one, and I was black, so let's get into it. Alex opened with e4, and I decided to play c6 Caro-Kann. This had been a weapon of mine during this event. And after d4, d5, I was actually not super sure which variation of the Caro-Kann he would play, but I actually thought it'd be really important to surprise him because he actually is a Caro-Kann practitioner himself. So I figured I'm really going to have to try to surprise him in one of these lines and get something that he might not be as familiar with since he knows them fairly well. Now, Alex actually opted for the advanced variation, and this was actually something I'd already faced this tournament because in round 2 against Andrew Hong, I had faced this position. I actually played c5, which was a line that I actually never played before in the advanced Caro, and actually, normally I'd just play bishop f5. But actually, I really got a good position against Andrew Hong, and there was no reason to really deviate. But I thought that because Alex had seen that game being in the tournament and seen the success that I'd had with it, he probably would be a little bit better prepared than Andrew Hong was. And then additionally, I know that c5 is actually the move that Alex always plays himself as black when playing the advanced Caro. So I figured it would be kind of unwise to go through this line again that he actually knows extremely well and had seen me play. So I decided to keep him on his heels a little bit, and I went back to bishop f5, which is the more popular move. And the idea is you just get the bishop outside the pawn chain and you get like this good French defense, if you will. Just to show you, after c5, what happens typically is they normally take on c5, and now black actually goes e6 and is actually willing to play a true French with the bishop locked behind the pawn chain because white's chain in the center has now been broken because of d takes e5, and black argues that his pawn structure in the long term will be better than white's. Anyways, I went bishop f5, and typically here white actually goes for knight f3, and then normally this is the short variation with bishop e2 and castles. But in this game, Alex went for the very, very ambitious and sharp h4. And h4 is quite a dangerous move because it immediately kind of threatens to try and trap the bishop on f5. If I made a kind of nothing move or normal move like e6, just trying to, continue to develop and open up this diagonal for my bishop, now g4 just traps it because after bishop e4 there's f3, and after bishop g6 h5, and you can see there are no more squares on the diagonal that are secure. So h4 already threatens to hunt down that bishop. Now there are 2 ways you can deal with this, and they both involve moving the h-pawn because you need basically a square on this diagonal for the bishop to go back to, and you don't really want to go back to the where you came from. So the 2 moves here are actually h6 and h5. And actually the first time I remember seeing this line was when Kramnik was actually playing Peter Leko in his World Championship match in the mid-2000s, and at the time, the rules of the World Championship match were that the challenger actually had to win the match to secure the title. So a tie actually did, or a draw rather, like after however many rounds they played, I think it was 12 or 16, it didn't actually go to a rapid tiebreak like what happened in the Carlsen-Karakin match. Actually, what would happen in that scenario is the World Championship holder would retain his title. And in that game, going into the last round, Leko was actually up a full point. So Kramnik was white and had a must situation on his hands. And Leko actually played a Caro-Kann, and Kramnik actually played this h4 move. And I can recall in that game that Leko went for the move h6. And the idea was that after g4, he actually didn't go back to h7 because he considered e6 to be positionally a little bit too dangerous. Note that after e6, f takes e6, these squares around the king are pretty weak, and white can go bishop d3 and try to argue for compensation based upon these weak squares. Note that if like bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, already there's some danger that lies on this diagonal, and this king is not totally secure. So instead, after g4 is played, Leko actually went bishop d7, and this move is actually playable, but it gives white a lot of space and initiative. And I can recall in the game, what happened was knight d2, e6, knight b3, restricting the c5 break, and white was already better. And what actually happened in the game is black tried to lash out and get activity with c5, and after d takes c5, bishop takes c5, knight takes e5, black regained the piece with queen a5 check. But after c3, queen takes e5, I can recall that white actually had a really nice bind on the dark squares, and also the two bishops. And white actually went on to win this game. Kramnik went on to win the game and actually retain his title. So that's just a little history lesson for you about this line. And I actually tried to play this with black myself, not specifically with this quick c5 break, but it turns out that white actually just has, a space advantage and typically has the better of these structures. So I do believe in principle that h5 is a slightly more correct move. And this is the modern treatment of this line. Most people actually go h5 now, and I did as well. So the downside to playing h5, though, is g5 is permanently kind of weak, or at least an outpost that white can utilize for his own pieces. So typically here, bishop g5 is actually the most popular move. And there's some line here that goes like queen b6, because you can't play e6 because the queen's hanging. Bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, queen takes b2. Queen takes b2. And I believe this queen takes b2 is already a mistake, because I can recall that like after e6, queen takes a1, queen b3, I believe the position is actually winning for white. The point is that with this e6 move, white really can't develop or black really can't develop his kingside bishop, and this king is kind of stuck in the middle. And meanwhile, the queen on a1 actually is trapped. And there's this huge issue where queen takes b7 and queen c8 mate is a threat. The rook on a8 is challenged. And, if f takes e6, knight f3, white will eventually castle, and this queen is just totally trapped. And even though black might get 2 rooks for the queen, because he might wind up getting the second rook, the lack of development really makes the king on e8 super weak. So bishop g5 has been played quite a bit. I believe it is the main line, and black has always, had to be very, very precise to solve the problems in that position. So, yeah, I must say, I definitely need to restudy this line, because it is a very, very tricky one. But I am aware that, going for, trying to be greedy and take on b2 is ill-advised. So anyways, instead of bishop g5, Alexander Ostrovskiy had another idea in mind and went for c4. This is a line that I had not had experience with myself, but I fortunately had looked at some games in the position and had some idea of how to play here. And I actually decided to play e6, and now bishop g5 doesn't have the same venom that it has normally, because I can go bishop e7 or even f6 to challenge that bishop. But now knight c3 was played, and I played d takes c4. And the idea with d takes c4 actually resolving this tension, you might say, why would you resolve the tension? Is because I actually wanted to make sure the d4 pawn is kind of a backward weakness. And by playing d takes c4, I kind of secure that. One thing I was a little bit worried about in some lines was a really quick queen b3 targeting b7. And so I just wanted to be able to kind of not allow that by taking on c4 and maybe going knight d7, knight b6. So after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, I went knight d7, and now you can see if queen b3 is played, that's not a problem for me. I can just go knight b6, attack the bishop on c4 and the pawn on d4 with the satisfactory position. And I just kind of like the fact that even though white has more space right now, the pawn structure is in black's favor. So I have that long-term trump that, I often talk about on this channel. I now went knight d7, like I said, and now queen b3 wasn't played. Instead, knight g2 was played, a normal developing move. And you might say, why knight to e2 instead of to f3? Well, a few reasons. First of all, with the knight on f3, black might consider bishop g4 at some point, pinning. And on e2, if I go bishop g4, then f3 is played. The other reason is that this knight now can sometimes go to f4, where it's actually quite active, and can maybe eye the h5 pawn, and sometimes even the e6 pawn for sacrifices. So there's some merit to putting it on e2. So after knight g2, I went for queen c7, and this is a little bit of a strange move. Why are you moving your queen here? Wasn't it more valuable to develop the knight or the bishop? The problem was I wasn't too sure where white's king was going to go, whether it was going to go kingside or queenside. And queen c7 is kind of a nice little waiting move that kind of, asks white that question. Note that if I develop the bishop to e7, now my knight on g8 is kind of restricted, and, it's unclear whether I really want to put it on h6. And if I put the knight on e7, then the bishop on f8 is kind of locked out. So with queen c7, I keep my flexibility a little bit. And in some lines, maybe I entertain castling queenside. So there's, multi-purpose move there. The other thing with queen c7 is it does overprotect the b7 pawn, which might be a concern, although I did mention that the knight could pop out to b6. So anyways, after queen c7, knight g3 was played, and you could see now the reason the knight went to e2. And my knight is challenging the bishop on f5 and the pawn on h5. And so there's really only two options you could play here. One would be bishop g6, and the other one would be g6. And they're kind of pros and cons to both. I mean, if you put the bishop on g6, I don't think that necessarily solves the problem of the h5 pawn long term, because white could consider playing a move like bishop d3 and getting rid of that bishop on g6, and maybe at some point the h5 pawn would be a target again. That being said, if I do take here, I drag the queen away from attacking the h5 pawn, so maybe it's not a huge deal. The other thing is actually when you put the bishop back on g6, you are, making sure you're not giving up a knight for a bishop, or giving up your bishop for the knight, which is, important because we talk about the bishop pair being an asset. But I actually played g6 here, and g6 here was a novelty. It hadn't been played before in the position. There were two other games I found in the database where bishop g6 was played, but my idea with g6 was that I kind of firmly solidify my pawn structure here, and I wasn't so reluctant to give up my bishop for this knight on g3 because I thought after knight takes f5, g takes f5, I'd have really good control of the e4 square, which was pretty much the only square the knight was considering going to because the other squares are covered. And I thought that, even though, I've lost the bishop pair, I also have good compensation in the form of counterplay on the g file if white elects to castle kingside. Last but not least, I do see, the d4 and e5 pawns as being potential targets. And now that this knight, the kingside knight is gone, they're a little bit harder to protect. So I thought all those factors and this compact structure in the middle would give black a reasonable play. Alex actually agreed with me because he actually went for bishop g5 and did not take the bishop on f5, and I think that makes some sense. Now you kind of take away the ability for me to castle queenside or even put a rook on d8, and you also kind of challenge the dark squares that have been weakened by this g6 move. I went for the move knight b6 now, challenging this bishop on c4, and white went bishop b3, backing up. And now I have a choice of how to finish my development, because it's clear I can't castle or put my rook on d8, and I need to figure out these pieces. I elected to play bishop e7 because I thought getting rid of these bishops would facilitate the rest of my development. Note that if I went for a move like knight e7, that's kind of problematic because now knight e4 comes, and knight f6 check and knight d6 check are real threats, so I didn't really want to allow that. Another thing that could be possible is bishop f6, and now you could see this rook would, have to move to a pretty unfortunate square. So instead I played bishop e7, and now rook c1 was played. That's somewhat logical, lining up the rook against the queen on c7. I also think an argument could have been made to, maybe consider castling at some point, but rook c1 does line up the queen on c7. And now I castled queenside, which you might consider is a little bit unusual given the fact that the queen and the king are on the same half-open file as that rook on c1. But I thought that there wasn't any kind of shot that took advantage of that right now. Note that after knight b5 is played, which it was played, I actually can just go queen d7. And what I realized here is that knight takes a7 check wins a pawn, but then the knight is actually trapped. So there's no good square to save this knight, and, well, black would just be up material. So that doesn't work. And after knight b5 check and after knight b5 and queen d7, white actually has to go into d6. But I actually calculated this. After bishop takes e7 was played, I played queen takes e7. And now after knight d6 check, I can just go to b8. And my queen is protecting f7. And my king is out of the line of fire on the c file. So I thought, I've managed to trade a minor piece, right? When you lack space, you want to trade a pair of minor pieces, sometimes two. And I've managed to nullify some of the pressure in the middle of the board and against my king. The only thing is this knight on d6. Now, in the previous position, actually, after knight d6 check was played, I actually was strongly considering the exchange sacrifice, rook takes d6, e d6, queen d6, because even though I only have a pawn for the exchange, this d4 pawn is isolated and weak and may drop. And you can see how my pawn structure is so wonderful. All my pieces are sort of primed to easily blockade the D pawn, so much so that white might actually want to give it up at some point, but then actually have no coverage in the middle if you do that. So the computer actually, when I was running this, it was giving an advantage of over half a pawn for white. But I think the more you actually let it run, the lower the advantage gets for white, because this positional compensation is quite good. And so I actually thought about this quite seriously, but I rejected sacrificing the exchange because I thought that with king b8, I actually have the option to just go knight c8 and evict the knight on d6 that way. So I thought there was actually no need to sack the exchange, especially when once this knight is evicted, the d4 pawn might be weak. So I actually felt pretty good here. Anyways, after king b8, white went queen d2. And I think queen d2 is also a kind of a sad admission that something has gone wrong, because you also may notice that castling here just hangs the h4 pawn in many lines. Now, perhaps right away I couldn't take on h4 because there's this knight f7 fork of my rooks. But you can see that castling does make this h4 pawn weak, and that's also the kind of the flaw of pushing your kingside pawns really quickly, is this king on e1 might not be as secure on the king side as it would want to be. So I actually thought my king on b8 was actually safer than white's king. After queen d2, I had another decision. Do I take on the exchange here? I mean, it's very viable, right? Like, I could play rook takes d6, e d6, queen d6, and if white castles, knight f6, and it looks to me like I have really good compensation here. I did consider it, but I thought, what? Maybe it's not necessary. I thought I wasn't in a desperate situation, so why give up the exchange if I don't really need to do it? But looking back on this, I mean, this is such a nice-looking position that it would need to be considered. Again, the computer does evaluate this as being better for white, but just optically, to me, it feels like black has all the fun. I mean, I can go rook d8, maybe put a knight on g4, the freeze this knight on g3, and even if the queens come off the board, I have really good compensation here. So this would be up my alley. And another option would be to go knight h6, and this is actually the best move in the position and a move I missed. The point is, now if white castles, I can actually take the pawn on h4 because f7 is now well covered by my knight on h6. So knight h6 would have been a really, really good move and something that I should have played. Black is better here, I believe. Instead, I played knight c8, and knight c8 on the face of it isn't bad, but I think I would have just been able to get a better version of the game, because essentially after knight h6, white needs to make another waiting move, and it's very hard for white to improve his position right now, considering there are no meaningful pawn breaks in white's position, and these knights are kind of doing the best job they can do here, and white can't castle. So it's just already tough for white to move, in my opinion. Anyways, I did go knight c8, and now knight takes f5 was played. I think that's actually a reasonable move. If you take this knight on c8, I just played rook takes, and then come back to d8 a second later and pressure the d4 pawn. And again, d4 is now going to be a constant target in positions like this because it can't be supported by another white pawn. Note that the e pawn and the c pawn are just not in a position to support the d pawn. So yeah, so knight takes f5 does make a little bit more sense, slowing, at least getting a bishop for the d pawn. And now I went g takes f5. Very important to keep this bishop on b3 restricted on this diagonal. White now, I thought, was in some real trouble because, again, you can't castle because h4 is hit, and now the d4 pawn looks like a backward pawn and weak. But I was very surprised by white's next move, and I think it took me aback a little bit because white played the move bishop d1. And bishop d1, on the face of it, isn't like the greatest move in the world or anything, but it's a move that does a good job of just creating a threat on h5, and it doesn't allow me to kind of slow play the position the way I wanted to anymore. I thought I would just get my pieces out and then hammer away at d4, but now white is at least attacking something, and I have to respect his ideas. So if you notice, h5 can't be defended right now, so I have to be active. And I thought with the king on e1, it would really make sense to be active by going f6. And f6 is a good move. f6 threatens f takes e5, opening up the position. Very logical here. And black is in great shape. White now went f4, reinforcing this e5 pawn, and I think again it just weakens this king on e1, and it's more and more apparent that it's probably unlikely the king will castle, and so again black is totally fine here, but in the next few moves I made some really curious decisions, and I think part of the reason I made these decisions is because I was already in some time trouble navigating the early opening phase when I was unfamiliar with the setup. Basically was where I spent a lot of my time. And I think here I need to hone in and understand that the new situation is fine for me. I just have to, be calm, cool, and collected. And, I started with the move f takes e5, and I believe this is already a mistake. The reason it's a mistake is because after the obvious recapture, this queen now has access to the g5 square and in turn the king side. Whereas a move ago, white did not have that opportunity. The other thing is that this is positive pawn tension for me because if I can take this whenever I want, and white doesn't really want to take on f6 because he helps me develop. I play knight takes f6, then my knight can jump into g4, d5, and he breaks up the pawn chain. So this is positive pawn tension for me, so I should keep this tension. There were other ways to keep the tension. One way would be knight h6, just popping the knight out here. Now knight g4 is an idea. And if white tries to take that h5 pawn, I can now play with the initiative with the move f takes e5 now. And the point is now after f takes e5, I have knight f7, and I'm threatening knight takes e5, and I'm covering the g5 square with my knight, so I'm not allowing white's queen the same freedom as before. So this would have been really promising. And note that if the queens stay on the board and these files are open, the king on e1 is certainly going to be more airy than my king on b8. So that was one way, knight h6. Another good way would have just been queen g7. And again, here, taking the pawn on h5 is just losing because after, queen g6, for instance, this knight is already in a very, very precarious spot. It can't go back anymore. And if you take on f6 here, I just recapture. And, I think this position is quite promising just here because now d4 is hit multiple times. h4 is also an opportunity for me. And, white's king is still kind of stuck here. So really there were just better moves than taking on e5, and I think I just panicked and just had a brain freeze because it's just f takes e5 is not super logical. After f takes e5, I made probably my second illogical move, which was rook d7. And I think this was a product of understanding the new realities. I saw that now queen g5 was a resource. So I thought, my initial idea was, I believe, to try and pop out the queen to g7 and just attack this knight. And now I saw queen g5 and I was like, oh man, how did I allow that? So because of that, I played rook d7 with the idea to now gang up on this d4 pawn with queen d8. Very unusual, but I thought if I gang up on this pawn, it's hard to defend. But now, white played bishop f3 and is actually starting to consolidate. The bishop guards the g2 pawn. It's actually well deployed on this diagonal now. And now white also has the option of going knight e2 to protect the d4 pawn like that. So instead of rook d7, there were better moves to put on the pressure. One was, again, knight h6. Connecting the rooks is never a bad thing. And now I'm ready to go to g4. And if white takes this pawn, I have knight g4 as an option. And if knight takes h5, I have knight f7 as an option again. Stopping queen g5, hitting e5. Very similar to the other line a move ago. Another opportunity would have just been queen d7, just targeting the d4 pawn right away like this. Now, I think the reason I didn't do this is I was reluctant to trade queens with white's king being in the middle of the board like this. But the queen trades can't be that bad for me. I mean, this e5 pawn is really sensitive. And, okay, white is not actually seriously worse here, but I do have some counterplay here, and the material is equal. So I think white would have a tough time of it to consolidate in this one. Another opportunity would have just been the move queen e8. This actually just protects the pawn, and then I can, develop my knights freely and, get at white's d4 pawn. So if like queen e8, bishop f3, knight b6, king d1 is the computer move. And this just goes to show how precarious white's position is, because king d1 is a move no human would ever play, lining the king against the rook and the queen. This position is just so unusual. I mean, if knight e7, knight e2, knight d5, king c2, this is just not a maneuver. King e1, king d1, king c2, that would be played by a human. And if those moves aren't played, black is getting a huge advantage. So that kind of tells me that this was probably, the way to go, to kind of slow play this position and protect h5. Anyways, I did go rook d7, and white went bishop f3. And now I went queen d8, following through with the plan of attacking d4. But now rook d1 was played, and I think this was actually the move I missed, that not only does the bishop consolidate now on g2, the g2 pawn and the king side, the rook now can scoot over to d1 and just protect the pawn. And what I realized here is that if I play c5 to add pressure to that pin, I was really wary of the move d5, which actually is a really well timed break now that the bishop is on this square, because now it stops me from opening up the line for my rook. And after e takes d5, knight takes f5 gives white way too much counterplay and activity. Now e6 would be a major threat, challenging the rook on the d file. The d pawn might drop thereafter, and white is not worse anymore. So it just really, really bothered me that now I could not even execute c5. And yeah, I panicked. I played the move knight b6 now, just trying to develop, and I jettisoned the h5 pawn, but there were better ways to do this. Instead, rook dh7 would have just, held everything together and acknowledged, yeah, I made a mistake. Maybe I allowed white to consolidate, but white still doesn't have any, is not up material and still has to worry about this kill on e1. This would have been a smarter way to hold the position together. Instead, I hadn't coped with the new reality of the position, and with knight b6, I actually just give up the h5 pawn. And this doesn't make sense because I don't have any impending attack. Now, once knight takes h5 was played, I see queen g5 is on the horizon. I'm shaking my head a little bit, mentally at least, recognizing that now this h-pawn is protected and passed. And endgames now are not good for me. But so I went for c5, trying to at least get my material back. But this is a huge, huge mistake, because now I open up the diagonal for this bishop on f3, and I open up the d line and make my king less secure. And Alex very, very quickly blitzed out queen g5, which is an extremely logical move, now taking advantage of the fact that endgames are quite playable for white. The reason for that is this bishop is really now very good, and this knight on h5 is actually quite annoying because it can spin around to f4 and target e6. So I'm in a world of pain now. I played c takes d4 trying to recover my pawn, but after queen takes d8, rook takes d8, knight f4, you can see now all of a sudden it doesn't matter that the king is on e1. It's actually, closer to the center than my king on b8. And white's minor pieces are superior to my minor pieces. And this h-pawn is a passed pawn. So even though the material is level, white just has a huge advantage here based upon all those factors. I have to immediately defend e6. So I went rook h6, but this is just a very unfortunate move to play. And now white went b3, a really, really excellent move, and I think shows Alex's class as an international master. Because when you are better, there's kind of this impulse to kind of rush it. But b3 is just a perfect move that limits the scope of this knight. So you can see now it can't go to c4, can't go to a4, can't go to d5 because white would just take it and then take the pawn on d4. And this knight on f4 is a wonderful blockading knight, which also attacks one of my weaknesses and can't be harassed by any of my pieces. So white is actually nearly winning with this b3 move. Very, very strong. I played knight e7, trying to fix my last piece. And after king f2, I was really, really concerned because now these rooks are connected. White has many very interesting plans. White can just play h5 potentially and just, keep this rook tied down. White could even go rook h3, rook g3 and try and invade on the g file. Could consider doubling rook d2 and rook a d1 on the d file. And there are just so many nice plans for white that I thought I need to try and do something to mix it up in this position and try to make it challenging. But in my attempt to mix it up, I actually created more weaknesses because I played the move a5. And a5 is not very good because I'm just weakening my knight here and I'm not actually creating any targets right now. If a4 is played, white's just going to leave it there. It's not going to take and activate my knight. So a5 doesn't really do anything. And after rook d2, Alex decided that doubling was simplest, just centralizing his rooks and targeting this d4 pawn, which can't really be supported by my other rook, which is tied down to the e6 pawn. And you could see here that all my pieces are just pretty bad. My knight can't move. My rook on h6 can't move. My rook on d8 is tied down to this So my knight on e7 doesn't have much scope, and yeah, just tough. And given all of that, I played knight c6. That was like the only piece I can move. But now white goes bishop takes c6, and after b takes c6, I have a new problem because I've weakened my pawn structure. I've created an extra island, and after rook c1, now there are several weak pawns that require my attention, and it's hard to cover them all. I went rook takes h4 just to try and get the h-pawn. I think if I go king b7, which you might say, well, why don't you just protect this one and isn't everything compact? I thought after king b7, white can now play g3, and there's just no way I can hold this position together because these pawns are well protected, and white can play rook c5 next and attack a5, and it's just impossible to keep everything together. So I wasn't buying this at all. So instead I thought, well, at least I'll trade one of my weak pawns for the h-pawn and, get something out of it. But now knight takes e6 was played, and somehow I missed the fact that c6 was not the only pawn that was loose if I moved my rook. So it went from bad to worse. And now you can see I have terribly weak pawns all over the place, and they just drop. My rook is attacked, and d4 is attacked, and c6 is attacked. And after rook d5, rook takes e6 is played. So now white is up a pawn with limited material, yes, but you can see white's pawns are a little bit more secure than mine. And now my knight on b6 is attacked. So I went king b7, just trying to defend it, but now rook c7 check challenges my king. I step back, rook c6, king b7, rook c7, just trying to gain some time. Very smart decision by Alex. When you don't have a lot of time, you can just, and you're playing with increment, you can make a few moves and you just gain 30 seconds. So he wasn't trying to take a draw here. He was just taking extra time. And after I moved back, he went rook c5. Just trying to trade now and consolidate, given that he was up a pawn. Now, rook c5 is not the best move in the position. Rook f7 would have actually been better. The point is that after rook takes e5, rook takes d4, this type of position, this endgame is actually totally winning because f5 very quickly drops. And so, yeah, I pretty much can't hold this pawn, and if it's 3 pawns to 1, it's going to be impossible to hold that. And you can see also that knight c6 is a nasty fork. So, yeah, so rook f7 would have been a little bit better, but rook c5 doesn't spoil anything. And I took on c5, and after knight takes, I actually only have one move in this position that, really tries to hold on to the game and fight, and it's actually the move king c8. And the point is that I actually step out of the way of forks myself, so that if knight e6, rook e4, knight takes, I can actually take this pawn on e5, and my king is stepped away to c8. What I did, unfortunately, is I played knight d5. And the problem with that is now when knight e6 was played, and I went rook e4, and then knight takes d4, I couldn't take on e5 because there was this nasty fork on my king and rook. So unfortunately here, I was 2 pawns down with pretty much no compensation in ending, and this is, one that, I should lose. I went knight e7 now, at least trying to threaten to win this e5 pawn, and, now at least I'm defending against this fork. And white played knight f3, just defending the pawn, and white is now consolidating, up 2 pawns. So I'm pretty much in a lost position, and I just tried to fight the best I can. I went king c7, trying to activate my king. Rook d4, a reasonable move. Trying to trade rooks is quite sensible. A lot of times, actually, they say knight endgames are like pawn endgames. So if you're, if you take that as a given, if you have a pair of knights and then 4 versus 2, if you ignore the knights, it's just 4 versus 2, and that's winning. So it's understandable that he just tries to get to a knight endgame 2 pawns up. Now, if I take To add insult to injury, after knight takes, my king actually can't cross the plane. Note, my king can't step up and challenge this pawn, and so I actually don't have any counterplay here, and this would be totally winning. So I decided to actually play king c6. And the point now is that if you take on e4, you have some work to do because my king can come into d5 and I can actually challenge the e5 pawn. It turns out that rook takes e4 is actually winning, but it requires some precision, and I understand why Alex didn't go for this, because you have to play a series of only moves to win the game. The line goes f takes e4, knight d2, only move, king d5, and then king e3, and you're actually trying to win the e4 pawn, and the idea is that if you win the e4 pawn for the e5 pawn, then it's 3 versus 1 again. But I can make it challenging. I can go knight f5 check and push the king back. And after king f4, you're attacking the knight and the pawn again, so it appears you're going to win. But now I can go knight h4 and attack the g pawn. And here the move is g4 to hold the g pawn in place because you want to keep the outside pass pawn. That one is going to tie my knight down. And I have knight g6 check, actually. And after king e3 back, knight takes e5, g5, this is actually the winning move. You retain your g pawn just long enough to actually secure the e4 pawn, and now this pawn is so much of a runner that the knight can't continue to challenge it. For instance, if I go knight f7, g6 just wins pretty easily, and or even knight takes e4, which recaptures a pawn and protects g5. And if I go knight g4 check now, king f4 just challenges this knight. And if I try a cheapo like e3, now after knight f3, the knight on g4 is attacked, and if the knight moves, the pawn e3 will be taken. And if I push e2, the knight holds the queening square. So no counterplay here. So actually, white could have, gotten to this knight endgame 2 pawns up, but it did require some precision. And because of that, he actually decided to play rook d6 instead. And now I played king c5, and all of a sudden I have a little bit of counterplay because this knight is tied down to the pawn on e5, and I'm going to try and follow up with knight c6 and kind of try to attack the e5 pawn. My goal is to get to a rook endgame just a pawn down and hope that the activity of my remaining pieces compensate my pawn deficit. And this is actually not so bad as it looks because now this king can't really activate and help out the white pieces. So I thought I maybe had a little something here. White now went a3, I think, trying to restrict my king's activity and try to get counterplay towards the king side. And I went knight d5. And I don't know where my knight was going here, but I think it maybe was going somewhere. And in some lines, actually, I'm actually threatening rook takes e5, because if rook takes, knight takes, king takes, I know I said knight endgames are pawn endgames, but because of the limited material, a 3 versus 2 is a very, very difficult to convert and might be a draw, because maybe my knight can actually sack itself for some of white's weak pawns. So let's say like king g3 is played, and now I play rook e5, knight takes, king takes. This is all of a sudden not so easy, although I'm noticing now that knight c4 does pick up this pawn, and now it would be easy having 2 connected passers. So, all right, so maybe it was losing regardless, but I was trying to get some positions that would look like that if I wasn't going to lose material. After knight d5, rook d8 was played. Just getting the rook far away from the king so I couldn't, win it somehow. And I went f4, and I like this move because, again, it limits the activity of the king. So all of a sudden, this king is kind of boxed out and can't support white advancing his pawns. And, of course, I'd be happy to trade my f-pawn for the g-pawn because the more limited material there is, the less the pawn endgames and the knight pawn endgames are dangerous, the more they become closer to draws than wins. For example, let's say I go g4 is played here and I take en passant. After king takes, now rook e3, and all of a sudden these pawns are targets and very, very hard to hold on to. So this would probably just be a draw. So after f4, rook a8 was played, attacking my a pawn, and I defended it. And then some checks, gaining time, and some more checks. And now g3 was played. And I think this is actually a sign of frustration from Ostrovskiy, that he kind of recognized it was hard to improve, because g3 is actually a mistake. A better move would actually have been a4 check. And I can understand why this is a bit counterintuitive, because it appears that you're pushing my king up the board. But the idea is that after king b4, there's rook b8 check, and wherever the king goes, c3 or a3, it's very difficult to get a second piece to actually attack the b pawn without actually allowing the e pawn to start running. Additionally, the a pawn becomes a target with rook b5, so it's very, very difficult to try and, get something going here. Last but not least, actually, if king takes b3 does happen, there's always knight d2 check, which is a very, very unfortunate fork. So it actually turns out that b3 is very, very difficult to actually win, capture and win. And because of that, it would be quite a decent plan for white to keep my king, far away from the e-pawn. Instead, after g3, I capture, and now the limited material makes it more difficult to convert this ending. And note that the king is still cut off this way. It still can't kind of get in and support the e-knight, or the e-pawn. It would love to get to f5, but that's just not happening right now. I went knight e7, just moving, and then we had a series of checks now, and knight c6. And now I'm actually attacking the e5 pawn, which is huge, protecting a5. I can't actually take e5 because rook takes a5 check would win the game and trade all the pieces. But I've managed to kind of keep the king tied up and the knight tied up. So this has been really good defense on my part. King f2 back was played now, and I went king b5, trying not to compromise my structure. My rook is perfectly placed. My knight is ideally placed. No reason to compromise. And now white played rook h4 and decided to kind of shift gears, because I kind of had created this really good fortress right now. And here I actually panicked. Now with rook h4, I think he's trying to swing his rook around and getting counterplay this way. But again, all my pieces are kind of ideally placed right now, and there's no reason to compromise that. And unfortunately, I decided to play a4. And the reason I decided to play a4 is I thought now is a moment to try and get at white's pawns and maybe trade material. Of course, if b takes a4, I play rook takes a4, and the a-pawn would drop. And then I could sack my knight for the e-pawn, and rook versus rook and knight is a simple draw. Instead, I should have just played king c5, just holding the position together and just waiting. If rook h5, king d5, and just waiting. Because now after a4, white actually got to play b4. And the issue is I thought now I could consider walking in and getting the a3 pawn. But what I missed is that I can't do that because knight d2 forks my king and rook. And to add insult to injury, now my a4 pawn is actually a weakness that can never be protected by my knight because it's two diagonals away from the pawn. And so all of a sudden, I've created an extra target, an extra weakness for myself when I'm not playing from a position of strength. So I should have just held firm. And this is the hardest thing to do when you're defending, is just hold firm and make your opponent prove their advantage. But it's usually the best thing to do. And I kind of lashed out because I thought I'd made so much progress, but I was still 2 pawns down, and there was no reason to create any targets. So, big mistake by me, because now after b4, it's much harder to defend. I went king b6 now, and now rook h6 was played, and you can already see this pin is kind of annoying. And now I went king b5, and now rook d6. And now white's considering rook d5 check, and I can't come up because rook c5. And so now, because of this b4 move, the rook actually has a potential anchor on the c5 square, which was not the case before. I went back, and now knight d2, rook h4, king e3, and now white is improving because I'm tied up. King c7, rook d5, rook h1, knight c4, rook h3, king d2, a little more challenging the king a little bit more. But yeah, I'm getting pushed back here, and it's all because of this construction, allowing b4 here, allowed white to press forward and get squares that he didn't have before. So now I'm just lost. But I would actually get one more chance, and I'm actually going to zip through a little bit to that opportunity because this is just a lot of technique pushing me back. So king d7, b5, rook b3, b6. You can see white is advancing slowly but surely. Knight c8, challenging the b-pawn. And here, actually, I think the cleanest way to win would have actually been rook c7 check. The point is that king d8 is forced because I have to hold on to my knight. And now white can just play e6. And the point is that after e6, if I take the pawn on b6, e7 check forces through white queening. And I pretty much have to take the rook on c7. And after e8 queen, knight takes e4, queen f7 check. White actually picks off the knight on c4, and this position is completely winning because not only is it, queen versus rook, which would be winning typically, the other issue is that I can't even try to take the a pawn because if rook takes a5, queen b4 check just picks off the rook. So actually, he could have forced through a queen by force, and I think maybe he'd seen ghosts of rook and knight maybe stopping. Maybe he saw rook and knight versus queen and thought, oh, this will be a draw. But yeah, this would just be a win because he picks off the knight. So yeah, I thought that would have been more direct. Instead, he went for b7. This allows me to fight a little bit longer because after rook takes b7, e6 check, and king takes e6, I have to play king takes e6 because if I go king d8, this actually loses to rook takes c8, unfortunately. And after king takes knight d6, the pawn goes through. But I thought that in this position, after king takes e6, he is now has a rook and a knight for and a pawn remaining. But I thought because it was an a pawn and the king was so far away from the a pawn, I actually still had chances to draw this one because the knight is kind of tied to the a pawn. And it's kind of funny because I would get a chance in a few moves. I went king d5, activating my king. And trying to step up with king d4. And my idea is to kind of creep behind and try to get at the a pawn. And after knight e3 check, I actually get my chance because after king d4, white actually played rook a8, which is a serious blunder. Instead, king e2 would keep things together and white would still be winning here because if I go rook b3, there's knight c2 check, and the knight covers the a3 pawn, and then the king, after my king moves, this king can step over and come a little bit closer and support and kick and evict the rook eventually from b3. But in this position, white played the egregious rook a8, and now black has a draw in hand. The move is king d3, and after king d3, all of a sudden, white is in some difficulty because if you take on a4, I have rook f7 check, and the knight is dropping because you can't actually go to e2 because I control that square, and if you block, well, I just take it. And so if the king moves, let's say king g2, I just take, and rook and king versus rook and pawn with the a pawn is completely drawn, especially with the king being so far away. So that would actually be a draw. And I played king d3, and now white played knight d5, and the position is a draw here after one move in particular. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out black to move and play and draw. It's actually not that difficult, but unfortunately I just missed it. Or I played the move order incorrectly. The move that draws in this position on move 79, by the way, is the move king c4. And the point is, now that this knight on e3 left the c4 square, I'm ready to cross the plane. And after knight d5, he is holding the c3 square, but now I have c4. And I also attack the knight with tempo. And so whatever the knight goes, let's say b4, I just go king b3. And I'm taking the a3 pawn next. And it's just a dead draw. And it's amazing because he can't even try to hold on to the a pawn. There's no move after king c4 that holds the a pawn. So remarkable. And it's a remarkable miss by me because I'd been defending for pretty much 40 moves. And I don't find the move that's super obvious. Instead, I played, after knight d5, I played rook f7 check first, and this is a huge mistake because now after king e1, I go king c4 now, and it fails to knight b6 check, and all of a sudden, the knight and the rook are both attacking a4, and the rook will capture on a4 and protect the pawn on a3, and this was impossible with the rook on the b7 square. It was impossible for the knight to get at a4 or support the a pawn at all. And after king c4, it's just a draw, simple draw. Very disappointing. I went rook f7 and just and I just mixed up the move order, king c4, and now he gets the a pawn. And I actually still have some semblance of a chance here, you might say, because the king is so close to the a pawn, and it would appear that the king on e1 is kind of cut off from supporting the a pawn. So it would seem kind of tough to usher it up the board with only the rook and knight supporting it. But with good technique, white managed to do just that. And so let's see what that technique looked like. So I played rook f6, challenging this knight. And now the key move here is rook a6, just defending the knight. And I thought, okay, here, maybe there's some chance because now the knight is pinned to the rook on a8, and it's hard to, and the rook can't move because the knight would hang, but white can now improve with the king and challenge my rook, and that's what wound up happening. So I tried to wait and shuffle, but the king came up the board, and once the king is in the game, then eventually the rook is freed. And now that the rook is freed, the pawn can start moving and the knight can move. And unfortunately, my king is just boxed out. It can't cross the plane at all. And it's just technique now. I played several more moves just because, I don't know, I think I was a little bit frustrated and I thought, okay, maybe you'd make another mistake. But with my king now kind of boxed out of action, there's just no way he's going to mess this up. And yeah, he just pushed his pawn up the board slowly but surely. I did manage to challenge him a little bit, cut him off, get my king back in the game, but he just kind of boxed me out slowly but surely and then advanced the a pawn, as you could see what that's looking like here. Yeah, rook d6 is a great move, now facilitating his king walking over. And after rook h8, I'm rook a1, I'm actually not even threatening to take the pawn because of the fork. And so he just moves his king closer. And once the king is near the a pawn and it's well supported, there's absolutely no chance. And that's pretty much what happens. And now I'm just completely boxed out. And rook e6 is a nice move. Obviously, if I take it, there's knight c7 check as a fork, recovering the rook. And then knight and pawn versus king is just winning. So I kept the rook on the board for a moment. But now king b6, rook c8, and rook e8 again. Funny fork tricks that he takes advantage of. And now again, if I play rook takes e8, knight c7 check. So after rook e8, I actually resigned on move. Well, what move was this? It was move 121. On move 121, I resigned. What can I say? Really, really tough game, a long game. And now, from 3 rounds, from 2 out of my last 3 rounds, I'd played over 100 move games and had really bad luck. I mean, if you think about the 138 move game from round 2, I was on the better side of that for a long time, and instead of winning, it was a draw. And then in this one, I was on the better side of it for the beginning of the game, and then I was much worse and losing, but I managed to fight, and I could have drawn the game, but I ultimately lost. And so from my 2 100-plus move games, I got only a half point out of 2, and that's extremely, extremely draining. And also hurts the morale a little bit because you're like, man, these are the type of games, the long games that I thrive in, and I'm just not sealing the deal. So very disappointing, but hey, you got to try and bounce back and recover, and that's what I needed to try to do. Anyways, that's it for this marathon game. If you like what you saw, please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please consider making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.